All right, good afternoon. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Lucas Chancel. I'm part of the local organization committee, and I hope you're enjoying this event as much as we are. For us, it was a fascinating 2 days and a half, really, with outstanding presentations, and the best is that more is to come. So before I leave the floor to Thomas, a few words. First, the results of yesterday's elections to the Equinec Council. So we're elected Sabine El-Khair from Oxford University. Congratulations to her. Where is she? She's not here. Facundo Alvarado. We know. He is here, hiding at the back, as usual. Koen de Kank from the University. And last but not least, Philippe Van Kerm from the University of Luxembourg. Congratulations. So these are the currently elected members of the council. Another notification, today the new president of the society starts. So Thomas Piketty is officially president from today onwards. And Stephen Jenkins from the LSE has been appointed president-elect from today onwards, so for a period of 2 years. All right, so I have the difficult task to introduce Thomas. He barely needs any introduction, so this will be very short and very brief. Just to say that we indeed owe him, all of us, an immense tribute. His contribution to the field has been immense. Indeed, in the realm of empirics, but also in the theory of inequality, as well as in the opening of this discipline to other social sciences and to the rest of society. I think he does this always with so much energy and generosity for us working with him at the World Inequality Lab, and I think beyond for this wider community of researchers, part of the World Inequality Database and the community of inequality researchers. Perhaps Thomas is driven by this belief that research, that ideas from research can actually change the world, and this is also what drives us all here. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Thomas.
Thank you, Luca. So let me start. So this is the first time I am president of something. You know, I don't know. I used to be co-director. I'm still co-director of World Inequality Lab with Luca and Gabriel and Facundo and many others, well, Emmanuel in particular. Let me, before I start, let me also ask you to stay until the end of the conference. You know, we put the best papers in the last session, you know, so sorry for all those that were not selected to make it to the last session, but now, many of the best papers, at least, are in the last session, so please, it's not nice, you know, that people who present in the last session, you know, everybody has gone away, so, okay. So let me start. So this is obviously a very general title, Rising Inequality and Globalization. So here is, you know, what I'm going to do in this presentation. I'm going to present. First, I'm going to start by presenting some material from the World Inequality Report. I will go very fast, and many of you might already have seen that. If you want to see more details on the World Inequality Report, just go online. Basically, this will be a way to motivate what I will present next, and I will show you a number of graphs showing first the large rebound of inequality in the recent decades that we see across the world, and most importantly, the fact that many of the downturns and upturns in the evolution of inequality in the past were due to change in policies, change in politics, which then will bring me to the second and main part of the talk, where I will present some result from this paper, Bramin-Lev versus Merchant Right, where basically what I'm doing is to try to open the black box of political attitudes toward inequality, which is an issue I was already very much interested in a long time ago. I wrote a paper called Social Mobility and Redistributive Politics that was published in the QJE in 1995, 24 years ago. I cannot believe I was already there, but apparently, which was really trying to understand how people learn from their mobility trajectories, trying to learn about the relative importance of effort and luck in the generation of income inequality. And for a long time, I wanted to return to the study of attitudes toward inequality, but then shortly after this 1995 paper, I started to collect historical data on France, and then Tony Atkinson arrived, and we started doing it for dozens of countries, and it took me 20 years, and so now I'm finally trying to escape from there, because I mean I'm still there, but you know at some point you want to move on, and so I'm sort of returning to an issue which I wanted to study for a long time, which is more the political aspect of inequality and better understanding attitudes toward inequality. So today I will mostly present new series on changing political cleavage in 3 countries, France, US, UK, from 1948 to 2017, documenting what I will describe as a shift from class-based political conflict to multiple elite, by which I mean intellectual versus business elite, and identity-based political conflict. And I will argue that this very long-run change can contribute to explain the lack of political response to rising inequality. So of course it's a incredibly complicated problem, and there's no way you can get a fully convincing answer to such a complicated problem. But I think at least this can be part of the explanation for the lack of political response to inequality, which then of course brings us to try to study the origin of this change in the structure of political cleavage. And so I will discuss different possible explanations. One of the explanation could be rise of globalization, and in particular the political cleavage about migration, creating division among lower income groups, and also to some extent among higher income groups. But I will argue that this is probably not the main reason, and that this evolution at least could have happened, and in a number of countries has happened, without the rise of migration or more identity cleavage, and might be explained just by the rise of higher education as sort of put an end to a very simple egalitarian education platform which existed at the time of primary and secondary education, which was simply, okay, we are going to get everybody till the end of primary education and everybody until the end of secondary. Once you enter the era of higher education, things are more complicated, because you cannot simply say we're going to get everybody to PhD. So you have to accept the idea of a persistent educational stratification, and you have to make it look fair, or even better, fair. And the problem is that, the parties used to be the left parties that sort of promoted the expansion of primary and secondary education in the mid-20th century, were not very good at convincing, the people who were sort of left behind in the education game and the education competitions, that they still cared about them. And so to summarize the argument, the left parties have been seen more and more as the party of the winners of the education game, and sometimes looking down at the losers of the education game, and this has completely transformed the structure of political conflict. Or at least I will argue that this is one of the mechanisms. Now there are other effects, in particular there's certainly a change in global ideology toward inequality redistribution, which has played a role, particularly following the fall of communism, which was a very had all sorts of negative effects for the people living under communism, but which put pressure on capitalist country to deliver more redistribution, and I think the fall of communism contributed to this change in global ideology, which also plays a role, obviously, in what I'm going to show you. So let me start with some summary findings from the World Inequality Report. So this is a simple graph showing that you have rising income inequality everywhere. So this is a simple indicator, top 10% income share. If you had perfect equality, it should be 10%. If you have perfect inequality, it should be 100%. So of course, it's always in between, but you can see it varies quite a lot between these two bands. So you have rising inequality pretty much everywhere, but at very different speed in different world regions, including for a given level of development. So typically the US has seen bigger rise in inequality than Europe. India has seen a much bigger rise in inequality than China, with less growth. So the relation between rising inequality and growth is complicated, and rising inequality is certainly not always good. But in any case, we have this very different evolution. And if you want to explain this different evolution, it's also useful to put this period, the post-1980 period, in a longer perspective. So this is what we can do for Europe, US, Japan. So here Europe is the weighted average more of Western Europe and Northern Europe. Now, for the rest of the world, we are not always able to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, which is why my previous book, Capital in the 21st Century, was, has had many limitations, but among the most obvious limitation, it was very much centered in the developed countries, the rich countries, partly for data access reason, which is that we were not able to have the full picture for developing countries. We have made some progress in this direction. We have tried very hard at the World Inequality Lab to make some progress, but it's still, what we have is still more limited. The other big limitation of my book, Capital in the 21st Century, is also that it treats political evolution a little bit like a black box, and so this is the other limitation that I'm trying to address today, trying to better understand the change in attitudes toward inequality. So if you put the recent period in historical perspective, so the post-1980 period in long-run perspective, you can see that the rise in inequality happened after post-war decades between 1950, 1970, 80, to some extent, of relatively moderate level of inequality, at least as compared to the beginning of the 20th century. So how do we explain all of this? Okay, I'm not going to redo the whole story again. I talk a lot about it in my previous book, but certainly World War I, World War II started a process of massive redistribution through destruction of wealth, but most of all through change in policy. So you have a major shift in policy that is triggered by World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, with the rise of the welfare state, the rise of progressive taxation, and which all of these factors, with many other changes in the legal system, nationalization, social relation, labor bargaining, etc., contribute to a much lower level of inequality in the post-war area. And then in the post-90 period, the fact that you have a very different magnitude of rising inequality, whether you look at US, Japan, or Europe, Sweden, Germany, France, etc., suggests that different institutions, different policies play a major role. Okay? If it was just globalization, globalization has happened not only in the US, but also in Japan, Sweden, etc. So you're going to have a hard time explaining this just with an explanation based on globalization. You need to refer to country-specific institutions. So among this policy, certainly change in tax progressivity is important. So in the middle of the 20th century, you had very high progressive tax rates. So, 1 century ago, there was no progressive income taxation, almost no progressive income taxation. And many people, around 1900 or 1910 were saying that progressive income tax will never happen. And then, it happened, and it happened pretty fast. So in particular in the US led the movement together with Britain to a large extent. And in the US, between 1932 and 1980, the top tax rate was 81% on average. I mean, it was sometimes 90, sometimes 70, just before Reagan arrived in power in 1980, but on average it was 81. And this is only the federal income tax rate. Okay, you also have state income tax of 5 to 10%. Now, of course, this applied only to very, very high income levels. And, I think this contributed a lot to the reduction of inequality at the top over this period. So, it's a complicated debate. There are many people who are still not ready for this conversation, but, the conversation is not going to go away, because at the end of the day, the truth is that productivity growth rate in the US economy, for instance, were twice as large between 1950 and 1980 or 1990 than what they have been between, since 1980, 1990. So, what's the point of having big incentives at the top if the productivity growth rates are divided by 2? It's not so clear. So if you have more innovation, at some point it should show up in productivity growth rate. Otherwise, what's the point? So at the end of the day, in the recent period, you had this huge rise in top shares and a complete stagnation of bottom incomes. So this, I think, these questions very seriously, the shift in policies that happened in the 1980s, and of course, this is an ongoing debate that people have today in the US. I think for very good reason. So you have this for income taxation. You have this for the taxation of wealth, also at least inherited wealth. So you can see again that UK, US, and Japan, have sort of led also the way toward progressive taxation of inherited wealth in the 20th century, whereas France and Germany did not use progressive taxation as much as the other countries. The only time in Germany you see the green curve where you have a 90% tax rate is when the German tax policy is set by the Allied Control Council, so by the Americans. And the Americans, they don't do that to punish the Germans, because this is what they are doing at home with the wealthy Americans. So this is, and for the US view of the time, this is part of the general civilization package. You bring democratic institutions together with the fiscal institutions that prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy. So this can seem like ancient history to you, but this is part of our common legacy, and this reminds us that things can change sometimes faster than we imagined beforehand. So this is part of the record. Now, of course, in France and Germany, there was a lot of redistribution through destruction, inflation. So you don't need progressive taxation as much as in Britain and the US. I think progressive taxation is a more civilized manner to do it, but of course, in history, always is not always fully rational. Okay, top progressive taxation is important, but of course there are many other issues of policies. In particular, what we have found with some of our new research with Gabriel and Emmanuel in the US is that probably the most striking evolution in the recent decades is not so much the increase of the top shares, but the complete collapse of the bottom 50% share, which is really quite spectacular. It was not very high to begin with, but it has basically been divided by two. So this corresponds to a complete stagnation of average per adult income around $15,000 per year in the US, in dollars of today. So, many of our colleagues in the US, when they get a pay proposal of 100,000, they feel it's really too low. Well, 15 is annual income of the bottom 50% of the US population, and it has stagnated at this level for the past couple of decades. So that's pretty spectacular. Now, how do you explain, and you don't see this in Europe, you don't see this complete collapse, and where the bottom 50% share in Europe is still much larger than the top 1% share. So that's a major difference. How do you explain this? Well, I'm not going to, try to quantify today the different mechanisms, because there are many different policies and institutions that play a role. But certainly, top income taxation is certainly not going to be the main or the most important explanation. So you have many other dimensions of policies that need to be considered. Certainly, the fall in the minimum wage played a big role. And I see Claire Montiello will approve this. And there is today, an attempt to bring the minimum wage back to higher levels, especially at the state level, given that the federal government does not do it. But certainly this is part of the system. Now, you cannot ask everything to the minimum wage. It also has to do with the system of acquisition of skills and educational systems that allow you to access high-paying jobs. And from this point of view, the inequality of access in education in the US, is really an issue which has been studied quite extensively, in particular by Raj and Emmanuel in the Equality of Opportunity Project. And you get this kind of graph from their research, which is something that was not available a couple of years ago and which is really quite spectacular. So you see, parental income rank and the probability to access higher education. So this is measured in 2014-15, so this is today, basically. And so what you see, you have almost a straight line, and it's almost a 45-degree line. Okay, so not quite. If your parents are poor, you still have a 20% chance to make it, and if your parents are rich, you only have a 95% chance to make it. But you almost go from 0 to 100. And of course, when you access higher education right there, it's not the same kind as higher education over there. Okay, so this in a way, this underestimates the magnitude of the problem. Now, this must contribute to the fact that the bottom 50% does not have access to very high paying and high productivity jobs, inequality in access in education. We are not able to say really by how much, but if you compare with Europe, it's not that Europe you have equal access to education, but the curve typically will be less steep, and also the concentration of educational spending, if you try to do computation for this different level, will be less extreme than what it is in the US. So presumably this has to do with what we are looking at. Let me mention another set of policy factors that matter a lot, which have to do with wealth policy in general, nationalization, privatization, public debt. This is a simple indicator that we constructed in the World Inequality Report. This is the share of net public wealth in net national wealth, defined as the sum of net public wealth and net private wealth. So China used to be communist, so 70% of net wealth, so this is according to our computations that we made with Li, Yang, and Gabriel Zucman, was public back in 1978. Today, we estimate it to be around 30%. What's striking, first, this 30% number, you should view it as an average between, in the housing sector, it's only 10% public and over 90% private, so almost everything has been privatized. But in the business sector, the company sector, it's still about 50% public. So 30 is sort of the average of 10 and 50, if you want to summarize, because national wealth will be sort of half residential housing and half business sector, to simplify. And so 30% will be the average of 10 and 50. You see that this has sort of stabilized since the crisis. So the Chinese Communist Party at this stage seems to be unwilling to go further in the privatization of the system. And the level at which it has stabilized, around 30%, is not uncomparable to the level of net public wealth that you had back in 1978 in so-called capitalist countries, which at the time were more mixed economies, mixed property systems and purely capitalist systems, in the sense that the share of net public wealth was between 20-30%. I mean, there are some countries in the 50s where it would have been even more. This corresponds to a situation where there was a relatively large public sector, in particular in the manufacturing sector, like in France, but also, utility sector in most countries, and very low public debt that had been annihilated in the 50s by a combination of inflation, exceptional progressive tax on private wealth, combination of all sorts of measures, so that many of these countries had huge public debt in 1945, 1950, and in 1955, 60, it's down to zero, and it was never reimbursed. It was just, suppressed by different ways. And so if you have no public debt and a substantial public sector, you get this substantial share of net public wealth. At the end of the period, you see how it gets negative in UK and US, which is striking because when I wrote my book in 2000, Capital in the 21st Century in 2013, the only country where it was negative in my set of developed countries was Italy. And 5 years later, you have the UK and the US as well. So negative means that the value of your public debt is higher than the value of the public infrastructure, public assets that are recorded by Statistical Institute in your national balance sheet. So this corresponds to a situation where even if you sell all the public buildings, public schools, hospitals to which you send our children, that will not be enough to reimburse the public debt. So I'm not suggesting, they should do this, but you would need then to pay rent to the private owners of the school and hospital in order to send your children to school, which many people would not like to do. But in a way, this is already what we are doing, through the public debt, through interest payment on the public debt. So it's a bit more abstract because it goes through the financial intermediation system. But really negative public wealth means that, in effect, private owners of wealth own, through their financial claims, everything there is to own in the country, all public infrastructure, plus an additional right on taxpayer payment for the future. Okay, so it could be much more negative. It could be minus 100%, 200%. I mean, at some point, of course, the people will disagree with that and will get rid of the debt through different ways. But in theory, this could get much more negative. So this is a situation which we don't quite perceive very strongly right now, of course, because interest rates are very small. So with interest rate of 0.1%, you don't really care. Well, at least you don't care so much. But the question is how long it will last. But with interest rate getting back to sort of normal historical level, a situation of negative public wealth means that the interest payment you have to make just to keep to stabilize your your level. This is taking a lot of your budget, which you cannot invest in education, health, global warming, whatever you want. So I don't know what's the optimum for the share of public wealth. That's a complicated issue. It depends on your ability to manage your public wealth sector. And I'm not saying the Communist Party of China is the best possible, governance system for public property. So I'm not saying 30% is the target, but negative is really very small as a share of public wealth. So that's part of the, change in the policy spectrum, ideological spectrum, which have contributed to the rise of inequality in general. Now, what I'm going to try to understand is why, this rising inequality, why is this not leading to rising demand for redistribution? So, if you take the simple model, with a median voter, whatever, your median voter should have more interest in redistribution. So what could be different? What are the reasons why it's not going to work? One possible explanation, very simple, and I think very common, and partly correct, is that, globalization and competition between countries have made vertical redistribution more difficult to organize. Now, if you take the extreme case where you cannot do any vertical redistribution anymore, because anybody having income higher than average can hide it in a tax haven at zero cost, and there's just nothing at all you can do, then the political conflict is going to focus on other policy instruments. So assume the only policy instrument that nation-states control is actually the control of their border, and everything else is impossible to... then the political discussion is going to focus entirely about border control, who gets in, who gets out, in particular about migrants, and you will have a form of political conflict that will be entirely about border control and migration, and you will have an end of class-based redistributive politics and a rise of identity-based conflict. And, I think it's clear that it's part of what has been happening, except that, this choice of organizing globalization this way, it's itself endogenous, because there's nothing that forces you to have treaties with free capital flows, with no automatic exchange of information, no common taxation, etc. So in the end, this is a choice that was made by people, so maybe sometimes people don't anticipate the full consequences of their choices, but at the end there must be, some group that felt and which still feel that this is working fine, at least in their interest, and don't want to change this organization of globalization. So to summarize, unequal globalization is a choice, and so all in all, what I'm going to suggest today is that this change in the structure of political conflict, with this intellectual elite, Brahmin left, and sort of business elite, merchant right, well, both are sort of happy with globalization as it is organized, and maybe this is part of the explanation why there's no change in this equilibrium. So, more generally, the general point I'm going to try to make is that you really need to go beyond median voter models of election if you want to understand the evolution of inequality. Attitudes toward inequality are complex mixture of self-interest promotion and belief system about how the economy is working and what can be done and what cannot be done. And if you want to analyze the future of redistribution, you first need to better understand, this sort of complex, multidimensional structure of attitudes toward inequality. So this is, what I try to do in this paper, but this is still only the beginning. So let me try to summarize what I do in this research. So, I construct long-run series on the changing structure of the electorate, who votes for which parties depending on different dimensions of inequality, income, wealth, education. So it's a very simple, descriptive series, but as far as I know, this had not been done before in a systematic manner, looking at it's important to start to look at a relatively long period of time, and in particular to start in the 40s, 50s, because sometimes people using this kind of post-electoral survey start in the 80s, 90s, where the sort of left-right system of the post-war era is has already gone under major changes. And you need to look at the 50s, 60s to sort of characterize how the class structure of political competition looks at. So this is what I will do today. I will mostly present work on France, US, Britain, because in these three countries you have relatively high-quality post-electoral surveys starting right after World War II. But I should say that this work is currently being extended to many other countries, in particular with Clara Tolenado, which some of you have seen, Amaury Guettin, who is somewhere, and so many people have been contributing to that, and we have now, I think, almost 30 countries, so we are trying to extend this project to a sort of much broader multi-country level in Western democracies, but also outside Western democracy. And we have a paper with Amaury Guetta and Abhijit Banerjee, which is available online, where we provide similar series for change in Indian elections over Congress Party versus BJP party since the 1960s until today. So this is part of a much broader project, which I offer a more detailed analysis of this material put in a broader context in a new book, Capital and Ideology, that will come out in French in September of this year and in English next February. But this is too early to present this. So today I will just present some of this material on France, US, Britain is part of the book, but there's a lot more in the book. Now, the secondary contribution of this research, which I want to summarize now because I will not really have time to return on it later, is more theoretical. So if you look at in the online paper, Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, I present very simple two-dimensional models of inequality, beliefs, and redistribution in order to interpret these findings. And in particular, I present a very simple extension. So, I referred earlier to this paper of mine that I published in QJE 1995, where it was a simple one-dimensional model of learning about the role of effort and luck in the generation of inequality, which I still sort of like, except that with this kind of one-dimensional model, you cannot explain what I find, which is that you have this differentiation across education and wealth, with an intellectual elite voting for a party, a business elite voting for another party. So what I propose is a minimal change in the model. It took me 25 years or 24 years to get there, but this is the most I could do, is to have now, I have the same model with two dimensions of effort. So there are two ways to get rich in life. You have educational effort, so you put a lot of effort to be admitted to Harvard or École Normale Supérieure or wherever you go. And then there's another dimension of effort, which is more business-related effort, effort to be promoted in a company, to make a very good business deal like Donald Trump will do, and not so good with the education effort. But okay, you have these two different dimensions of effort. Now, of course, you can be good at both dimensions. It also happens, but some people. So what's going to happen in this theoretical model is that these dynasties are going to try to learn about the effort parameter, the education effort parameter, and the business effort parameter. And basically, in equilibrium, what you're going to have, it's very simple, you're going to have two different kind of sort of elite dynasties. You have the dynasties that have been very successful at accessing higher education institutions. They believe a lot in the, effort elasticity of, educational achievement. And those who have been more successful in business career, who believe more in the other dimension of effort. And they're going to have, they don't have exactly the same preferences over policy, because maybe the Brahmin Left, this educational elite, they want a bit more taxation than the business elite, for instance, because they want to fund museums or top universities or things like that. But at the end of the day, they tend to look down a little bit at the poorly achieving people in education, because they believe basically they didn't put enough effort. Okay, so they have developed a new ideology of effort and meritocracy, which is not exactly the same as the one of Trump and the business elite, but still, which is quite, looking down at the poor. And so that's the basic model that I have in mind, which it's very simple. If you know the one-dimensional model of learning about effort, you just add another dimension of effort. But I'm not going to give you the formal equation, but I think you can see how it works, and you can look online. So what I'm going to do is to focus on the empirical findings from now on. And in particular, I'm going to focus on, so the main empirical finding is going to be very simple, is that both in France, US, UK, in the 50s, 60s, the vote for either Democratic Party in the US, Labour Party in the UK, or the mixture of socialist, communist, etc. party that you have in France, was associated with lower education, lower income. So this is what I call a class-based political conflict, and I think it's prone to redistributive policies, in the sense that the political conflict is going to focus a lot on the right level of redistribution. This has gradually become associated since the 1970s, 80s with higher education voters, voting for the more and more for Democratic, Labour, Socialist Party, giving rise in the 1990s, 2000 to what I will describe as a multiple elite party system. And, I think this can explain why redistributive issues have become less central. This can also explain what we sometimes describe as the rise of populism, which I think, it's difficult to understand the rise of populism if you don't first try to understand the rise of elitism and the fact that the two governing parties sort of have been attracting two different elites, and so people who are not who are at the bottom of every dimension, in education, wealth, income, they might feel that they have been abandoned. And there is actually some data, which I don't think I will show today, but which you will find online, that in fact all the drop in turnout, electoral participation has been, in the bottom education, bottom income groups in recent decades, which suggests that the people, it's not that they, sometimes people say, okay, they love to vote for a racist party, but if they really love to vote for racist parties, they should be voting. But you have a huge drop in participation, which suggests something a bit more complicated, presumably that they don't feel very well represented by the existing political party. Okay, so I'm going to show you this kind of graph. So this is an example for France. So this is a very simple indicator. This is the difference between the percentage of university graduates voting for left parties and percentage of non-university graduates voting for left. So when it's negative, in the 50s, 60s, it means that the university graduates are voting more for the right. And when it becomes positive, it means that they are voting more for the left. Now, what's spectacular is that you will see this is very robust. Whatever you do with, no matter how you slice the data, you will get it back. And also, you get the same. So this is the same for the US. So here it is after control, but whether you put it before control or after control, like age control, income control, you get the same evolution. Now, this is the same for the UK with the Labour Party vote. Actually, my favorite graph, so here this is again percentage among university graduate versus non-university graduate. Now the problem is that the proportion of university graduate, of course, is increasing a lot over time. So what I prefer to do is to look at fixed fractile of the population. You will not be surprised by this choice. You look at top 10% education vis-à-vis bottom 90%. I will show you the more detailed data, granular data on the different educational degrees in a second. But basically, this makes, this is the same, except that this is even more striking because at the end of the period, the higher you are in higher education, the more you vote for the Democratic Party. So typically PhD, people with PhD, which are 2% of the US electorate right now, you have 75% vote for Hillary Clinton. And this was not a novelty due to the Trump effect. This was going like that for a long time. I mean, of course, Trump contributed to this, but you have to look at it from a more long-run perspective to understand this. So you can see, it's very striking. To me, it's really very striking that you have such a similar evolution for the three countries. You see that Britain is sort of lagging behind a little bit, which suggests that the Labour Party was a party that initially was sort of more lower class in a way that not only the Democratic Party in the US, but also the Socialist and Communist Party in France. Remember, Keynes, in the interwar period said that, he famously wrote that he would never vote for the Labour Party. He had this famous paper written in the 1920s saying why I am a liberal, and he said basically, I will vote for the Liberal Party until my death because the Labour Party, basically, this is a party with no intellectual elite. They have no good intellectuals. They have no good economists in particular. These are dangerous people, These are populists, basically. What are they going to do if they come to power? They have no good. And so, then, of course, Keynes died in 1946, which is exactly when the Liberal Party disappeared and was finally replaced by the Labour Party. So had he lived a bit longer, maybe he would have become a good Labour Brahmin advisor, but it's just saying that the Labour Party was frightening for a big part of the intellectual elite in the UK for a long time. So it took a longer time in Britain. Well, this is what the data say. I mean, Frank, you were not frightened, but this is a different generation. But at that time, it took a long time for the Labour Party to have more votes than the Conservative Party, than the Tories, but it finally happened. By the way, there's someone who sort of predicted this, which is this incredible book published in 1958 by someone called Michael Young, which some of you might know, who's a sociologist who was working with the Labour Party in 1945, did lots of things, and he left the Labour Party in the 50s because he said, there's a problem, you're not serious enough about education and putting an end to the elitist education system in the UK. And he wrote this book called The Rise of Meritocracy. It was the first time the word meritocracy was used. And this is an incredible novel of anticipation trying to imagine the society in 2030. And so he imagines everything that happens between 1958 and 2030, and basically the system becomes more and more stratified in terms of education. The Labour Party becomes the technicians' party, and they mostly are in favor of the, highly skilled, but not the very top skilled group, which are well defended by the Tories. And then you have a third party that comes in, called the Populist Party, which is basically these are the half of the population who are being told at age 5 or 10 that they are completely useless, basically. So this is what happened around 1990 to 2000, according to Michael Young in 1958. The science of education, economists of education have made great discoveries and discover that you can, decide at age 5 or 10 that half of the population, is useless and they should just receive welfare for the rest of their life. Now, the problem is that the people don't like too much this conclusion, and they still believe that a common education system could be good for them. The experts say it's completely useless. But so in the end, this ends up in a terrible revolution in 2020, 2030. And Michael Young, who describes himself as a sociologist writing the book, disappears in the riots in this revolution in 2030. This is an incredible book. Read it. So anyway, he understood everything back in 1958, but even in his worst scenario, he actually did not imagine that the very highly educated will turn Labour rather than conservative. So in his, even in this complete scenario, the Labour Party will become the technicians' party, but not the Oxbridge Party. But it did. So that's what we are going to try to understand. Why do you have a similar evolution? We find this, let me say also with Clara and Amaury, we've looked at many other countries, Germany, Sweden, Canada, it's a very general evolution. So why is this happening? So in the US, there's a standard theory of why the poor white left the Democratic Party, which is the theory of the civil right decade. So after the 60s, so as you know, these different parties have very different historical origins. So in France and UK, the Labour Party in the UK and the Socialist Communist Party in France have sort of similar origin, except that the two parties split in 1920 over the issue of support to the Soviet Union in France, whereas it's a unitary party for Britain. But in the US, it's completely different origin because the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. For a long time, it was the party of segregation. And then in the 1960s, for all sorts of reasons, international, geopolitical, whatever, and also the big grassroots movement led by African American, the Democratic Party, it's not that they wanted to send the federal troops to the South, but they had to do it, and they had to go for a civil rights movement. And then the story goes, will be, well, once the Democratic Party sort of was nice to the black, then all the poor whites started to flee the party, and they turned Nixon, then they turned Reagan, today they turned Trump, and everything started because of this, and this is just the racial division, basically, among the poor that has created the sort of embourgeoisement of the Democratic Party, and the fact that now they only have the educated white plus the black. Now, it's an interesting hypothesis, which is, of course, this is putting a lot of blame on the poor white voters. Basically, this is saying, it's like the Democratic elite saying, okay, they have abandoned us. It's not that we have abandoned them; it's that they have become so racist. We do everything we can for them, but there's nothing we can do. The problem with this theory is it's not only that it's very, comfortable for the people at the top of the Democratic Party to describe things this way. It's also that if you have this kind of theories, then why do you have exactly the same evolution in France? You don't have a civil rights movement in the 60s in France. You don't have a civil rights movement in Britain. So, of course, you could say, well, in Europe, you have the migration cleavage, which sort of plays a similar role with some of the poor white, don't like too much migrants from outside Europe, except that it doesn't really start at that time. It starts much later. It bumps in more in the 80s, 90s. And so the fact that it starts so early everywhere with the same timing, and also when we look at other countries with very little political cleavage about migration, I think we need to look at possible other explanation. And so the US-centered view, centered on the civil rights decade, I think is not completely persuasive, and this is what I'm trying to question in a way in this research. Well, I didn't know I was going to question that before, but given what I find, I think we need for common explanation. So this is, I'm going to present you more data along this line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with more details on the evidence for France, because after all, you're in Paris, and France is an interesting country, and so let me start with France. Then I will move to the US, and finally move to Britain, and at the end, I will, I will deal with a number of open questions, but basically, I have already told you, a lot of the issues. It's not that the racial or migration or identity dimension of the conflict has not grown over time. It has grown over time. But I think there are reasons to believe that there's more than that. And that in a way, the same evolution could have happened, I think, even without, the rise of the racial and identity cleavage. So let me start with France. So, okay, I use a number of surveys. So what you should have in mind about post-electoral survey is that, unfortunately, their sample size is limited, typically 4,000, 5,000. So it's okay for the long-run evolution, I will show you, but don't try to interpret the little election-to-election variation, because, it's with small variation, it's not, it's just not significant, okay? So what's good about the French survey is that you have detailed questionnaire about wealth, asset ownership, which, as we will see, has a much stronger impact on voting attitudes than income. Because income is a complicated object, as we all know here for the study of inequality. Income comes both from human capital, education, labor income, and from financial wealth, real assets, capital income. And so it's given that education and wealth are going to have very different effect on voting attitude. Income is sort of in between, so it's complicated to study. So what's good in the French survey is that you can break down the two quite well. At least starting in the 70s. Okay, so I will start showing you more detailed results on education, then income, then wealth, and finally religion and foreign origins to the extent that you can measure it in the French context.